Build skills with experts anytime, anywhere. Get certified, get ahead. The world's largest selection of courses, affordable online courses and learning opportunities, top categories.
Product development has grown dramatically over the last decade, and Scrum is the most popular Agile framework. Although Scrum is very popular, many Scrum practitioners lack fundamental knowledge about what Scrum is and what it isn't. This course is for anyone who wants to demonstrate their fundamental knowledge of Scrum by earning the Professional Scrum Master Level 1 certification by Scrum.org. In this course, you will validate what you already know about Scrum, plus fill in any gaps and correct any misconceptions you may have about Scrum. Some of the major topics we will cover include the certification differences between the Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org, the 5 Scrum events, the 3 Scrum roles, the 3 Scrum artifacts. You'll examine these and other topics, so by the end of first, you'll examine the essential parts of Scrum, starting with a quick overview of Scrum's pillars, values, roles, artifacts, and events. Next, you'll more closely examine the Scrum team roles to learn what each role manages within Scrum. Finally, you'll learn the essential parts of Scrum's artifacts and events. When you're finished with this Scrum course, you'll be more confident to pass any Scrum exam that tests for fundamental Scrum knowledge. Let's take a moment to review how this course is structured. This course has 6 modules. In this module, you'll quickly review the parts of Scrum that you should be familiar with, like Scrum's 3 roles, 5 values, 5 events, and 3 artifacts, and the 3 pillars of empirical process control theory. In the next module, you'll distinguish between the 2 major Scrum organizations, Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org. Both offer certifications in Scrum, but their approaches to testing Scrum fundamental knowledge are different. This course prepares you to take the Professional Scrum Master Level 1 exam by Scrum.org. Next, you'll dissect and amplify the team roles within Scrum. Scrum's 3 roles, Scrum Master, Product Owner, Developer, are differentiated in this way. Scrum Masters manage the Scrum process, Product Owners manage the product value, and Devs manage the solution. Importantly, no one in Scrum manages people. People are empowered and self-directed. Within Scrum, people manage themselves in a coordinated way to achieve great things together as a Scrum team. After this, you'll explore the 4 Scrum events: Sprint Planning, Daily Scrum, Sprint Review, and Sprint Retrospective, all wrapped into a 5th container event called a Sprint. These are familiar events for someone experienced with Scrum, but to pass the PSM Level 1 exam, you'll need to clearly understand the attributes of each event. Then, you'll touch on artifacts that many experienced Scrum Masters use, including burn-down charts, burn-up charts, test plans, test cases, and more. But in Scrum, there are only 3 artifacts that are required: Product Increment, Product Backlog, and Sprint Backlog. Any other artifact is a Scrum add-on and not expressly part of the Scrum framework. In the final module, you'll address other Scrum topics that aren't otherwise addressed, like how to start a Scrum project, how to cancel a Scrum sprint, what flexibility exists to change what's happening in a sprint. Again, experience helps to answer these questions, and there are many practices and approaches to handling these things, and your experience alone may lead to answering some questions incorrectly on the PSM Level 1 exam. To pass the PSM Level 1 exam, you need to understand what the Scrum Guide says and what it doesn't say, and how it all applies to these nuts and bolts matters. Process control theory, or empiricism. Empirical process theories came into existence in the mid-20th century. Empiricism is a philosophy that asserts that knowledge, all knowledge, comes fully or primarily through sensory experience. Empiricism says you know something when you experience something. Think about a software development project using a new smartphone app or web application. How do you know whether the smartphone or web app does what it's supposed to do? That customers will like it. Empirical philosophy says that you will know these things when you and your customers experience using the smartphone or web app. Knowing comes through doing, through experiencing. Empirical process control has 3 pillars which create the bedrock foundation for Scrum development efforts. They are transparency, inspection, adaptation. You need to know these 3 pillars for the PSM Level 1 exam. Everything about Scrum is transparent. What the Scrum team wants to build is transparent by using a visible feature list called the product backlog. What the development team is working on is transparent too, using the sprint backlog. And the different events in Scrum make the work of the Scrum team transparent to stakeholders outside of the Scrum team. Scrum makes the development work available for inspection, which is the second pillar. Scrum's rules encourage frequent and continuous involvement by the customer, so the customer can see what the development team is creating. Scrum uses regular time-boxed events to ensure that the right people are regularly inspecting the development team's work. The third pillar is adaptation, and it naturally follows the 2 preceding pillars of transparency and inspection. Scrum wants teams to adapt their products to better satisfy the needs of the customer for whom they work. Each time the Scrum team gathers for a Scrum event or meeting, it gives the team members an opportunity to inspect and adapt what the team is doing. If a Scrum team is transparent about what they want to do, what they are doing, and what they have already done, they can then allow themselves and others to inspect and adapt the Scrum team's work to better fulfill the organization's mission and goals. Most every organization nowadays espouses a certain number of values which guide the organization's way of doing business. Scrum has 5 values which guide the interactions of the people inside and outside of the Scrum team. The 5 values are courage, commitment, focus, openness, and respect. You should know what these 5 values are and memorize them. To make these easy to memorize and recall, I reordered these 5 values to create this acronym, 4CC. I have a son who goes by CC as one of his many nicknames, so with his help, the acronym 4CC helps me remember Scrum's 5 values. If you're located in the United States, and you're also in one of the 35 states that has a CC's Pizza buffet, maybe you can think of going for CC's Pizza. However you do it, you'll need to remember these 5 values for the PSM exam. What does Scrum value by upholding these 5 values? Focus. Scrum wants team members who are focused on the work of the building of a great new product, one sprint at a time, and not be sidetracked by doing other work outside of the sprint goal. Multitasking, then, is the absence of being focused. Openness. Scrum values open dialogue and openness about how and what they're doing. Scrum values frank discussions about the challenges the team faces in doing their work, so they can find ways to overcome those challenges. Respect. Like virtually every organization, Scrum needs everyone to be respectful and to be respected, and to value the independent and capable contributions of each person on and outside of the team. Courage. Sometimes Scrum teams face challenging obstacles to overcome. Sometimes Scrum teams face challenging people outside the Scrum team that impede their work. In both cases, the Scrum value of courage is an exhortation to the Scrum team to work on solving difficult problems together, whether those are technical problems, people problems, or organizational problems. commitment. In Scrum, the whole team commits to doing their best to achieve their goals. They're committed to fully pursuing after each sprint goal. To do that, Scrum teams need the companion values of focus, openness, respect, and courage. If you have had even just one day of experience on a Scrum development effort, you know what the 3 Scrum roles are. The Scrum Master and the Product Owner are very clearly defined roles, but the third role can be a little confusing, so let's focus on that. In Scrum, anyone who is on the Scrum team and isn't either the Scrum Master or the Product Owner is, by definition, on the development team. In Scrum, anyone on the development team is a developer. This is where things can get a little confusing. Usually, we think of a developer as someone who writes program code, maybe the person who does some architectural work, some design work. We think of a software engineer. But in Scrum, other roles within an organization are all wrapped together in one single role called developer. Anyone who is creating the solution is a developer. So a QA analyst, a security analyst, a database administrator, a business analyst, a manager, whatever title is on your business card, if you're on a Scrum team and you're not the product owner or the Scrum Master, then you're a developer on the development team. In the November 2017 edition of the Scrum Guide, Sutherland and Schwaber appear to minimize the confusion by removing the word developer from this latest edition. They just refer to the development team instead, which is a subset of the Scrum team. I'm guessing this is because they are advancing the idea that Scrum is not only a way of building software products, but it's a way of building any kind of product or result, software or otherwise. Scrum's roles can be surprisingly confusing for people who are new to Scrum. I was in a meeting once where people were figuring out how to adopt Scrum throughout the entire organization. The idea of referring to a business analyst as a developer in a Scrum team became a point of healthy debate, but it was an important discussion to have if that organization was going to adopt Scrum in its purest, unadulterated sense. We'll cover these roles more in depth in a later module. For now, just understand that, in a Scrum team, there are no project managers, no testers, no managers, no programmers. That may be what an organization calls these people, but in Scrum, if you're on a Scrum team, you're either the Scrum Master, the Product Owner, or you're a developer on the development team. Those are the only 3 roles that Scrum defines and upholds within the Scrum framework. Scrum has waffled a bit on what those time-boxed sprint things are called. Are they meetings? Are they ceremonies? Are they called something else? And if they are different, what difference does it make? In the November 2017 edition of the official Scrum Guide, Sutherland and Schwaber referred to Scrum time boxes as events. A sprint is a time-boxed container event that can last up to 30 days with a preference for the shorter time box rather than a longer time box. The other 4 Scrum events fit inside this container event. The daily Scrum is a time-boxed event lasting no more than 15 minutes. The other Scrum events, Sprint Planning, Sprint Review, and Sprint Retrospective, are time-boxed events that have maximum time limits corresponding to the length of the Scrum sprint. The current Scrum Guide calls these events not meetings. Is there a difference? From a practical standpoint, I don't think so. Well-run meetings bring people together to plan, problem solve, and generate a good outcome at the end of the meeting. Scrum's 4 events and the container event, the sprint, are well-run, time-boxed gatherings that bring people together to plan, problem solve, and generate good outcomes at the event's conclusion. For the PSM Level 1 exam, expect to see questions about Scrum's events, not Scrum's meetings. There is an activity that Scrum does define that is not called an event, and that is backlog refinement. Backlog refinement can occur whenever Scrum teams feel it's necessary to have. I'll cover all these 4 Scrum events and the backlog refinement activity in more detail later in this course. In a traditional project, a project team will create many artifacts. The business requirements document, a detailed design document, a test strategy and test plan, test cases, user manuals, implementation plans, communication plans, a risk register, and perhaps much more. In Scrum, none of these artifacts are required. That's not to say that none of them will still be needed in your organizational context, though. Rather, it means that in Scrum, none of them are required by the rules of Scrum. There's also the definition of done, which Scrum doesn't list as one of the 3 Scrum artifacts. The definition of done is the Scrum team's agreement of what it means when the development team asserts that something they've worked on is done. While this agreement doesn't have to be codified and made visible like the way the product backlog and sprint backlogs are visible, I think it's best when the definition of done is written down and made visible to the whole Scrum team and anyone else who has an interest in knowing what the team's definition of done is. Let me conclude this module with a short story. I was once in a meeting with a Scrum Master who had been certified by the Scrum Alliance. This person was a certified Scrum Master, which later in this course I'll explain what that means. I was certified too, but my certification is from Scrum.org, another organization that advances and supports Scrum practitioners around the world. The Scrum.org certification used for demonstrating fundamental Scrum knowledge is the Professional Scrum Master Level 1, and, as you'll soon discover, is a more rigorous certification to earn than the Certified Scrum Master certification by Scrum Alliance. Anyway, this other Scrum Master began making claims and assertions about how a Scrum team should operate that I knew just weren't true. For instance, this other Scrum Master asserted that the team had to use a sprint burn-down chart, and that they had to estimate using story points, and that the product owner had to attend the team's daily Scrum each morning. As a professional Scrum Master, I knew that none of these assertions were true about Scrum, and I was troubled by the way this other Scrum Master approached her team like she was a project manager, not a servant leader. Scrum doesn't require the use of burn-down charts, doesn't tell teams how to estimate, let alone that they have to use story points. And the only mandatory attendees for the daily Scrum are members of the development team. The Scrum Master and product owner are, in fact, optional attendees. To successfully earn the Professional Scrum Master Level 1 certification from Scrum.org, you need to know Scrum well enough to separate Scrum truth from Scrum myth. Throughout this course, I'll share some common myths about Scrum so you'll know that they are myths, and so you'll know what the right answer is when you face these kinds of questions on a Scrum exam. Let me conclude this module now, and let's move on to the next module, distinguishing between Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org. There are a lot of organizations that support Scrum practitioners. That's not surprising because according to the most recent State of Agile report by Version 1, which is a toolmaker for Agile teams, Scrum continues to be the most popular Agile framework in use today. That dominance has eroded slightly over the last few years, but Scrum still dominates the landscape, and that dominance seems likely to continue for the next few years, if not more. Part of that dominance is because Scrum has been around since the early 1990s, and so some of the oldest Agile and Scrum organizations have been around now for almost 20 years. Let's briefly walk back in time and see how the current organizations came into being, and then we'll look at the distinctions of the 2 primary Scrum organizations, Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org. By now, I'm sure you're familiar with that transformative document called the Manifesto for Agile Software Development, or more succinctly, just the Agile Manifesto. It was created inside a Utah ski lodge by 17 software developers who met together in February 2001. Among that elite group were these two men, Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland. Ken Schwaber and a few others from that group of 17 then formed the Agile Alliance, and Ken was its first chairman. The Agile Alliance is a nonprofit organization that supports people who explore and apply Agile values, principles, and practices. They do this primarily through sponsoring conferences, including the biggest Agile conference in North America. But the Agile Alliance doesn't do anything with credentialing anyone for anything. Today, the Agile Alliance has over 50,000 members. Then, later in 2001, Ken Schwaber, along with Mike Cohn and Esther Derby, founded the Scrum Alliance, and Ken chaired this organization too. This organization has a surprisingly broad missional focus like the Agile Alliance. The Scrum Alliance's mission is to guide and inspire individuals, leaders, and organizations with practices, principles, and values that create workplaces that are joyful, prosperous, and sustainable. Were you surprised that their mission doesn't say anything about Scrum? I know I was the first time I read their mission statement. In fact, Scrum Alliance says, quote, "We focus on creating value for our certificants and members by inspiring, enabling, and guiding the use of Scrum and other Agile methods to create effective and collaborative work environments." End quote. The Scrum Alliance explains further the key words from their mission statement. Inspire. We inspire individuals, leaders, and organizations to adopt Agile mindsets. We support their transformations with training and shared stories of change and innovation in companies around the world. Enable. We enable the work of our certificants and members through a group network of Agile peers, trainers, and coaches. We develop content and learning opportunities, including webinars, global and regional events, local user groups, and more. Guide. We guide the application of Agile practices, principles, and values through our career-long certification path. Our community of coaches and trainers are focused on providing knowledge, skills, and experience that support Agile transformations for both individuals and organizations. Here's how I look at these two organizations. In North America, the Agile Alliance is best known for its big, week-long Agile conference that has over 200 breakout sessions and over 2,000 attendees. It's a big-time event for Agile practitioners of every stripe. Conversely, Scrum Alliance is best known for its certifications for all three Scrum roles, and for certifying Scrum coaches and trainers, too. The Scrum Alliance has certified over 750,000 people in Scrum, and the bulk of those have been certified as Scrum Masters. Let's go back to our timeline. In 2006, Scrum's other co-creator, Jeff Sutherland, created his own company, Scrum Inc., but he also taught and continues to teach Scrum courses under the umbrella of the Scrum Alliance. Scrum Inc. is a for-profit consulting and training organization, and neither organizes conferences like the Agile Alliance, nor is it the administrator behind its own certifications like the Scrum Alliance. I won't have anything more to say about Scrum Inc. from here on. I've mentioned three organizations so far: Agile Alliance, Scrum Alliance, and Scrum Inc. Now things are going to get a little interesting because in 2009, Ken Schwaber left the Scrum Alliance over strategic direction, and he founded another Scrum organization, Scrum.org. Like the Scrum Alliance, Scrum.org offers certifications in Scrum, the professional Scrum series, which aren't as well known as the certifications by Scrum Alliance, but as you'll see in just a moment, These certifications arguably have more value in what they purport to do: recognize Scrum practitioners for their Scrum knowledge. In 2010, the co-creators of Scrum, Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, compiled essential Scrum knowledge together and created a short, simple document called the Scrum Guide. I call this the official Scrum Guide because these two men are Scrum's co-creators. Since 2010, Schwaber and Sutherland have issued periodic updates to elaborate and clarify the rules of Scrum. The most recent Scrum Guide update at the time I recorded this course is November 2017. In the race for certifying Scrum practitioners, there is, for many employers, essentially a two-horse race. One set of credentials come from the Scrum Alliance, and the other set of credentials come from Scrum.org. If you search for Scrum Master jobs on your favorite job search website, employers nearly always ask job seekers for Scrum Alliance's popular Certified Scrum Master credential. But some employers explicitly include Scrum.org's Professional Scrum Master credential as an equally suitable credential. In my opinion, an employer ought to prefer the Professional Scrum Master over the Certified Scrum Master if they value Scrum credentials at all, for reasons you'll see in just a moment. Let's do a head-to-head comparison between Scrum Alliance's Certified Scrum Master, or CSM, certification and Scrum.org's Professional Scrum Master Level 1, or PSM, credential. By the end of this module, you should understand why I value the PSM over the CSM, and I have both certifications, so it's not like I'm particularly biased. You should also be equipped to explain to an employer why they should value the PSM credential even if they don't specify PSM as a requirement for a Scrum Master or Agile Coach position they've posted to a job search website. Both the CSM and PSM require you to pass an exam. On the strength of passing an exam, you'll be granted either the CSM or PSM certification, depending, of course, on which of the two exams you're taking. The first point of distinction between the CSM and PSM has to do with training. The Scrum Alliance requires a mandatory 2-day training for certification aspirants, whereas Scrum.org recommends training but does not make it an exam prerequisite. Before you take the CSM exam, you must enroll in a mandatory 2-day Scrum Master training class from the Scrum Alliance. To do that, you'll visit the Scrum Alliance website and find a local trainer offering the 2-day CSM training. Once you take that 2-day Scrum Master training, you'll immediately be qualified to take the CSM exam online, which is included in the cost of your training. And if you pass the CSM online exam, you'll immediately be certified as a Scrum Master through the Scrum Alliance. But the CSM training is expensive. That's a deal breaker for many certification aspirants, especially if their employer isn't willing or able to pay for Scrum training. How much does this 2-day training cost? Generally, you can expect to pay between $1,000 and $1,300 USD, depending on the trainer and whether you're getting any discounts, like an early bird registration discount or a group discount. Scrum Alliance takes a decentralized approach when it comes to how their trainers deliver their training service. All Scrum Alliance trainers align their training to the values and principles of Agile and to the official Scrum Guide, but exactly how they do that and what points they may choose to emphasize is left up to individual trainers. Conversely, Scrum.org does not require you to sit for any training class at all to take the PSM Level 1 exam. Scrum.org recommends that you get Scrum training, but if you come well prepared and, ideally, have real-world experience using Scrum, even if it's just a few months of experience, you can pass the PSM exam. My Pluralsight course is going to help you pass the PSM exam. Since there is no training requirement before taking Scrum.org's PSM Level 1 exam, there is an exam cost of only $150 USD. That's a lot less than paying $1,000 or $1,300 for a 2-day training and an exam, especially if you don't need the mandatory 2-day training. Scrum.org centralizes the way their trainers train. If you seek out training through Scrum.org, the training you'll receive will have less variation than what you would get if you sought out training from Scrum Alliance. Scrum.org trainers all use the same training materials that Scrum.org provides, whereas Scrum Alliance allows trainers to develop their own Scrum training materials. Now let's examine the exams. Both the CSM and PSM exams are non-proctored online exams that are open book and open note. Those are the similarities, but there are some very significant differences between the two exams. Let's start with the passing score. The CSM is much harder to pass than the PSM. For the CSM, there are just 35 multiple choice questions, and you need to only answer 24 of those questions correctly to pass. That's a passing score of just a shade under 69%. If you were awake during the mandatory 2-day CSM training, you're going to pass the CSM exam. Conversely, the PSM exam uses 80 multiple choice, true and false, and multiple answer questions, and you'll need to get 68 of those questions correct. That's a passing score of 85%, which is a significantly higher bar than the CSM's passing score of 69%. The PSM exam has more questions and a higher passing score requirement than the CSM, making it a harder exam to pass. The PSM isn't a hard exam. It's just harder to pass than the CSM exam. How about the content of the exams? They're both online exams, but are the questions of similar difficulty? From my experience, and the experience of many others who hold both the CSM and PSM certifications, the PSM questions are going to be generally harder than the CSM questions. Some PSM exam questions are going to be a lot harder than what you'll find on the CSM exam. Then again, some questions on the PSM exam will be about the same level of difficulty as the CSM exam. Here's some good news for you, though. None of the questions are particularly tricky, which is nice, but you must understand Scrum's fundamentals much better to pass the PSM exam than with the CSM exam. My CSM trainer said that virtually everyone who takes the CSM exam passes it, and I believe it. I know people who have tried taking the PSM and failed on their first attempt because they weren't well prepared enough. Now you can understand why I value the PSM over the CSM. The CSM is a can't-fail exam that you're entitled to take if you pay $1,000 or more for the mandatory 2-day training by a Scrum Alliance trainer. The PSM exam requires you to know Scrum's fundamentals reasonably well and much better than an equivalent CSM certification holder. There are more differences between the CSM and PSM exam. The CSM exam has no time limit, so you can Google questions you don't know the answer to and never worry about running out of time. Conversely, the PSM exam is time-boxed to 60 minutes. Yes, both exams are open book, open note, but with the PSM exam, you have 60 minutes to answer 80 questions and get a score that is at least 85%. If you don't know your stuff, you don't have enough time to Google more than a couple of questions. You've got to know Scrum's fundamentals well to successfully pass the PSM exam. The last difference I'd like to point out is that with Scrum Alliance, you'll be required to pay a renewal fee of $100 USD every 2 years to maintain your CSM certification. With Scrum.org, once you've earned the credential, there are no renewal requirements. It's your credential for life. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this module and think that Scrum Alliance's CSM credential is meritless. I'm not saying that. The CSM credential simply means that someone sat through a 2-day training class and was awake enough to pass a 35-question exam with a passing score of at least 69%. If the CSM trainer is good, and my CSM trainer was very good, then the CSM training money is well spent and the CSM has value because it gave the CSM aspirant a terrific training experience and a chance to clarify their understanding of Scrum fundamentals. But there are plenty of CSM credential holders who still don't know or understand Scrum's fundamentals, and that's why it's ludicrous for employers to require CSM certification for any open Scrum Master positions they have available. Far more important than credentials are real-life experiences using Scrum and how a person uses Scrum to develop products that customers love. But you may never get a chance to show off your Scrum knowledge to a prospective employer unless you have the right credentials. So, there's value in Scrum credentialing beyond your own sense of self-satisfaction. Here's a module summary of what we covered. There are many Scrum organizations asserting to support Scrum practitioners, but the two biggest, most popular organizations, Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org, were founded by Scrum's creators. Both organizations offer Scrum credentials. Scrum Alliance offers the Certified Scrum Master, or CSM, and Scrum.org offers the Professional Scrum Master, or PSM. The CSM is costly because of the 2-day training requirement, but once you pay for that training, it's almost impossible to fail the exam. You will have to pay a renewal fee every 2 years to maintain the credential. Conversely, the PSM doesn't require any formal Scrum training. It's low cost, and there's no renewal fee. The PSM is a more difficult exam to pass because of the 60-minute time limit, because the number, type, and difficulty of the questions it uses, and because of the higher passing score of 85%. And although Scrum certifications are often required for job seekers looking for a Scrum Master job, in practical terms, a Scrum Master's experience and personal expertise is more important than any Scrum credential.